Hello and welcome to this episode of the Rock Health Summit virtual series. I'm Jen Horonjeff. I'm the founder and CEO of Savvy Cooperative, which is actually a marketplace for patient insights. And it's why I am so thrilled to be joined today by Susannah Fox, a champion for patients, who is going to tell us more about her new book I have displayed right here, Rebel Health. And I'm just so excited to be chatting with you, my friend and visionary. And just to set the stage a little bit for folks, I'll brag about you myself that you are the advisor and board member of numerous other organizations because we're all looking for your opinion and insights to help shape the future of healthcare. And formerly, you were also the Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So I'm just so excited to have you here with me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled.
So, Rebel Health, what an amazing book, also an amazing title. And, in my words, Rebel Health is really about patients who aren't waiting. As a patient myself, this is something that resonates very much with me about how we can actually use our patient experience to inform, improve, and accelerate healthcare innovations. You were kind enough in your book to give Savvy a shout out for the efforts that we're doing to try to use that patient experience. So, one of the things that I think about as a patient is it's so hard to get anybody to listen. Patient advocacy and patient insights are not like that sexy topic that a lot of people like to jump in and sort of put their weight behind. So talk to me. How are we so lucky to have you on our side championing the patient experience?
Thank you. I feel a sense of responsibility for all of the stories that have been shared with me over the last 20 years as a researcher, as someone who has conducted field work like an anthropologist in online communities of patients, survivors, and caregivers. There are so many people who had shared their stories of grit and survival and innovation and invention that I needed to share that with the world. My other motivation was that when I started getting invited into higher level conversations in healthcare, into places like Rock Health, into places like the White House, I realized that not everybody has had the privilege that I've had of spending this much time with people who are building what I think of as the missing infrastructure of healthcare.
Yes. Oh, and I love that. Like even the subtitle of the book, A Field Guide to Patient-Led Revolution in Medical Care. It's amazing. I actually just got goosebumps as I read that out loud. Just thinking about that, right? And because there's so many different parts of the healthcare ecosystem. That's what a lot of the time people lose is that healthcare is complicated and there's so many different types of stakeholders. And while we could talk about them all day from different sort of nuances, I want to really focus sort of on both the patient community aspect as well as to the innovators, the entrepreneurs, those that are investing into this space that are, part of our audience here today. So if we think about it first from the patient perspective, sorry, I'm always going to go there first. Talk to me about, how patients can use this as a field guide. You mentioned in there, that patients can be searching for information and that just in time, someone like you. Talk to me about what that means.
So the idea of a just-in-time someone like you gets to a central thesis of the book, which is you are not alone. There are people who would love to help you if only they knew how to find you. And that goes to the frankly universal experience of getting a new diagnosis or of having mysterious symptoms, of having a new disability, of being dropped into the maze of healthcare and not knowing which way to turn. That if you can be brave enough to raise your hand and ask for help, there are unseen networks of patient survivors and caregivers who would love to help you. They're going to share their maps of the maze. And a lot of this stems from the idea that nobody wants to do this work. A lot of us are going along in life, frankly, hoping that we don't have to interact with the medical system, hoping that we don't have to interact with healthcare. But when you do, know that there are ways that you can step into your power and make positive change for yourself, for your family, and for your community.
Uh, I mean, I think that's so important and a great message for patients. So, as somebody who grew up with a pediatric illness, a form of juvenile arthritis, I didn't meet any other patients like me until I was an adult. It was something that was like stigmatized and just trying to navigate the world and then becoming an adult and trying to figure out how the heck do I do this on my own? It's We didn't have the same resources that patients today have, the access. So talk to me too. You note in the book there's several different types of sort of archetypes here. So talk me through what those are so that our audience can, understand a little bit more about how we can think about your role in this.
When I started to write the book, I was thinking about writing a book about innovation in healthcare. And because I'd had so much experience in looking at innovation in clinical trials, medical device innovation. I ran an innovation lab at HHS. That was the role of the chief technology officer at HHS. But when I started looking back at all of my fieldwork notes, I started to see patterns in the way that patients respond to a crisis. And I realized that it would be most useful to write this field guide to say there are four types of people that you're going to meet in the revolution. The first type of person is a seeker. Seekers are not getting answers to their questions, and they go and find out. The thing to know about seekers is that they do not give up. I really admire them for that spirit. The second group of people that you'll meet in the revolution are networkers. They're the most visible members of the patient-led, caregiver-led, survivor-led revolution in medical care because they're the loudest. They're the people who are on social media platforms. They're the ones who are asking questions at conferences because they have a whole group of people around them. They learn in community and they pool resources. They're the ones that, frankly, if you're in marketing, you really want to get next to the networkers. The third group emerged when I started looking particularly at device innovation, but also systems innovation. And the third group are solvers. Solvers are people who cannot help but take something apart in order to put it back together again better. And the fourth group emerged when I was interviewing seekers, networkers, and solvers about how they'd been successful in creating change. Each one of them said there was one person who shared mainstream resources with them. And I named that group champions. Champions recognize a patient-led innovation and they get them the funding, the regulatory guidance, the press attention, whatever mainstream resource that champion has access to, they share it with a patient-led team and they're able to fast track that innovation.
Oh, and I love this sort of categorization. I think it really helps to get us to understand what our individual roles can be, especially for those out there trying to build things for patients. I'm going to read one quote from the book that I think really needs to be highlighted, underlined, where you say, "We need to take these unrecognized experts, that's the patients, seriously, precisely because their influence is so much more important than in other sectors, because our health is at stake." And in my line of work, we talk about that all the time, that nobody wants to solve healthcare more than patients. We have a very invested interest in doing this. My work is a selfish endeavor by trying to help make sure that other people can work with patients to understand their experiences so that collectively we can accelerate that process to move things forward. So also, we talked about these four different types of individuals. For our audience today of those entrepreneurs, those investors, people working in healthcare, where do you see them sort of falling in these buckets so that they can sort of understand their position?
Well, on a personal level, if you yourself are dealing with a diagnosis or you have a child or a parent or someone in your life who's dealing with, as I said, a new diagnosis or new disability or new mystery, then you want to look at these archetypes and decide, do you want to become a seeker, a networker, a solver, or a champion, or do you want to partner with someone? One of the messages that I have for people is that you don't have to do all of this work yourself. There are people that you can partner with. In terms of at a company level, or if you're starting a business, I already mentioned that you're going to want, once you have a product, once you have a service that you think is really useful, you're going to want to make sure that you understand the networkers who are in your target audience, because they're the people who can help you elevate the conversation about this issue and about your product or service. But you're also going to want to make it really easy for seekers to find you. There's so often a situation where a solution is out there and people don't know about it, but seekers will not stop. They'll try and find it. If you're at the stage where you're developing a product or developing a service, you're going to want to partner with solvers. Solvers are people with lived experience who can tell you, this is just not going to work for me. I have so many stories about companies or policymakers who have an idea, but they don't test it with someone with lived experience. And here I want to turn the tables, Jen, and say, I bet you have examples of people who have created a product and then been surprised that something didn't work. And I just would love to invite you to tell a story about maybe somebody who came to you and asked you to help them figure out a problem they were having.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what I've made an organization around this. And I think before I give you examples, you put a quote in the book that I would love to read because it just hits home on things that I think will set the stage for that. You say, there is often a mismatch between what mainstream healthcare wants to build and the problems that patients need to solve. Pharmaceutical companies keep making tiny pills for people living with tremors or low dexterity. Medical device companies and health system hoard data about people's own bodies. Researchers prioritize work that will land them in academic endorsements that come from publication in a prestigious journal rather than solving everyday challenges. They ignore or do not even see the issues that crowds the left side of the needs not met spectrum. So that, I think, is really what we're talking about here is how can we make sure that people are solving the problems that patients actually have? And that's what my sort of soapbox is that, we need to understand that. And so, we do a lot of work at Savvy about understanding some of that early discovery. Do patients need this? Do they need your new app? I don't know. And that's why you should actually ask patients about what that is. When we look in the pharmaceutical space, before you even decide what molecule you're going to explore, how are you getting feedback from patients to understand what their unmet needs are? I'm doing a series of interviews right now for a client, a pharmaceutical company, that it just keeps coming up from the patients with a certain autoimmune disease that they're exhausted. Of course, the company's trying to measure something else, but they're like, nothing else matters. I'm just so tired. So looking at that, thinking from the technical space, one example is a couple years ago now, AstraZeneca came to us during the pandemic, trying to quickly iterate to move to more decentralized trials. And they were creating an app for people to be using to get, to offer their trials remotely, but also to really understand the experience of getting your medications at home. And patients were going through these wireframes of the app and being like, I'm confused. Like, what part of the box am I checking for damage? Is it the cardboard box? Is it the box inside? And, all sorts of different parts of it. But what happened was
incredible golden opportunity for learning.
Absolutely. And then, this pharmaceutical company made a huge change in their process based on patient feedback. And what's interesting to note in this particular case for all of you business-minded people that are trying to weigh out, well, how much does that cost? Something that that AstraZeneca was finding is that their solutions may be actually costing them money to implement, but they saw it as an investment in the overall expenses in their trials, because if we don't get this right, then you can be losing a lot of money. And that's really where I think that people need to understand that aspect, that it's either we do it now or you're going to pay later, because it's just so important to get it right.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I've seen over and over, where I'm thinking about, for example, the design of a piece of research, and only inviting patients or survivors in after the data is in. No, you should invite people in during the design of the survey, of the trial, like whatever it is. You actually want to get people at the front end to help you come up with the questions, with the targets that are going to be important to them, because then they can make sure that their community understands that this was designed with the target audience, and people will be more committed. It'll be easier, for example, to recruit for a clinical trial. It'll be easier for people to see that this is going to be useful to them. And I have to tell you something that I've been seeing as I talk about my book when I go and speak to a general audience versus when I speak to a healthcare audience. When I'm at a bookstore or a general public event, there's so much anger. There is so much anger about the American healthcare system that I think we need to be aware of. And it's that sense of getting close to your customer so that you can understand where that anger is coming from. That's the broad picture of, talking publicly about healthcare. Um, Imagine how close you can get with someone who actually uses your device, with somebody who actually comes into your hospital, who comes into your clinic. What an opportunity to learn from them firsthand. And that's one of the things that I really want to bring to leaders is get out of your office and go and sit on a bench somewhere in your waiting room and start to understand how people are really interacting with the services that you provide.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's so important. And I think to your point about, people who work in healthcare versus those that are kind of more on the outside. Look, even when I was starting Savvy, I had people go like, "Wait, that doesn't exist." Like, you need to go have a place to talk to patients, because in any other sector it would be so obvious that of course you would talk to your end user. But in healthcare, we have different people who are prescribing and paying and making all these decisions for patients, and then it's this lowly, not my actual words and way I think about it, patient that's the user. And so that's what's so frustrating, is that we design these things in silos and then we thrust them upon patients and then call them non-compliant when in truth they have not had a say in that design. So like you say, like, how do we get them involved in all of those early stages so that it can be co-created rather than just forced upon?
Yeah. And there's been a misunderstanding about who is the customer. There's been a culture and a practice where, for example, medical device companies saw the prescribing clinician as their customer, not the end user, not the patient who actually is going to use that continuous glucose monitor or that ICD. Um, and that's where we can get into the data conversation, where because the prescribing clinician was the customer for this device, then of course the prescribing clinician is the customer for any data that's generated by that personal medical device. Again, that's a mismatch. That's a missed opportunity for everyone. And it's something that I really am passionate about and point out, that we all should have access to the data that's generated by our own bodies. And frankly, entrepreneurs should be on board with this, because that is an opportunity for new businesses to thrive. When patients have access to that data, they're going to need help interpreting it and figuring out what to do with that data.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important, especially for this audience that may be more on the tech savvy side of things. And also, too, Rock Health put out their Rock Health Digital Health Consumer Adoption Report back in 2020. And you're referencing this in the book, too, about how I believe it's 83% of adults are tracking some aspect of their health, and 65% are using some sort of digital tool to do so. So, where do you see the opportunity for those out there that are working in these spaces to utilize your field guide in order to improve the products and services they're putting out there?
Well, the first thing that I would say is there is an unseen market of, unfortunately, suffering. There is so much invisible suffering that as a patient, you are just down deep in the dark maze of healthcare. But as an entrepreneur, you can realize that that's a business opportunity. There's an opportunity for a market that mainstream healthcare is not paying attention to. There are patients who need your help. And so in my book, I talk about how to look for those sectors. And then once you've recognized a problem that is not being solved and there's a constituency around it, you can tap into the energy of seekers, networkers, and solvers who are from that community, who can help you figure out how to serve that group. And again, if we all are asking for more and better access to data, that is again going to be a wave that lifts all boats, and it allows people to create innovations that we haven't even imagined yet.
Yeah, and let's keep talking about data. So it was actually a couple years ago that Savvy worked with the American Medical Association to do a report for them related to patient and consumer sort of preferences on health data privacy. And one part of it that was really interesting was this idea of an opt-in or an opt-out of getting access to data or sharing data around too, because that's where I think people think about like how is data being shared externally, but another aspect too is how do patients have access to that information. So I think there's two parts of the data aspect that we need to really be mindful of. What are your thoughts on these spaces about how data should be shared to external partners and to the patients themselves?
Well, I think that everything should flow through the patient. I think that patients need to understand what their rights are, that they have a right of access. And that's true of electronic medical records. And I think that it should be true of device data as well. And so that's the first thing, that patients need to understand what their rights are, and also what the opportunity is if they get access to more data. Um, Ask me again the second part of the question.
Well, maybe before we go to a second part, I want you to give me examples. I know you have plenty of examples of patients that have wanted access to their data and have not gotten it, and the steps they've taken to be able to access that data. So give us some examples.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite examples is Hugo Campos. He lives with a heart condition that requires him to have an implantable cardiac defibrillator, an ICD. And as soon as he was diagnosed, he realized that it would be to his benefit to understand what foods, what activities, what drinks would send him into AFib, would make his heart flutter. And so he asked his doctor if he could have access to the data that's being generated by his own device. And the doctor said no. So Hugo wrote to the company and said, I'd like to have access to my data. And the device company said no. Well, at this time, unfortunately, Hugo also lost access to health insurance and realized that nobody was going to be able to service his device without health insurance. This was before Obamacare. And so what Hugo did was pretty extraordinary. He went from San Francisco all the way across the country to Greenville, South Carolina, went to school to become an ICD technician with the goal of having a client of one himself. And he learned how to not only service his own ICD, but also, therefore, get access to the data so that he could run N of one experiments to understand, for example, that whiskey sent him into AFib. He had no way of seeing that because it's not as if you can bring an alcoholic drink to a doctor's office and say, could you check me while I have this drink? And yet it's very, very important information. The challenge that Hugo has is that there are very few patients who understand that this data exists and that they don't have access to it. Contrast that with the diabetes device movement, the hashtag We Are Not Waiting, and all of the goodness that has come over the last 10 years from people like John Kostick, Ben West, Dana Lewis, Scott Librand, Amy Tenderick. I could go on. There's a broad-based group of people who have demanded access to diabetes devices like continuous glucose monitors, and they have won that access. And here's the key: the industry has responded by creating more and better devices to serve this market that prior to this revolution, it was an invisible market. It was unseen suffering. And it was the patients themselves that elevated this conversation, demanded access to the data, and now it is standard practice, so that people have access to their own device data. Because of course, living with diabetes and not having access to your own data is like driving on a road where all the lights are out on your dashboard. It just makes sense.
I think it's such a great example to show the opportunity here that when incentives are aligned, everybody can win. And so that's what we want our audience here to understand, is that if you really tap into what those unmet needs are for patients, there is a business opportunity just right at your doorstep. And I think one thing that I want to drive home is it's not just any patient. It's talking to the right patients at the right time. Early days, starting Savvy, we would see where people would go, companies, startups would go and turn for sort of that patient experience. A lot of it was happening on Craigslist. You would just go and put up a post and say, hey, like, I need people for this focus group. And, who are those people you're talking to? And still today, we combat a lot of people trying to like fraudulently say, I have a certain condition so they can make a buck in trying to share their insights. And it's doing a disservice to patients. And I think to those entrepreneurs out there as well, if you're not talking to the right people and you're just asking friends and family to weigh in on what it's like living with, type 1 diabetes, you are not going to get the insights that you need. And so that's where, again, you are sort of investing in something that may be bound to fail if you don't get those insights. So just to be clear on when we talk about this, who we're
I love
talking
this.
to.
And I think that it's a really great place to end, because it's this question of trust, that a community will be able to see that they can trust you and they will welcome you in and they will reward you with insights. Thank
Yes.
you.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to make you do one last thing. You talk about how there's all these organizations that are out there that were grassroots organizations that were then turned more into formal organizations or drove certain innovations forward. So I'm going to make you do a prediction here. Where are we going in this space of what is it now that we could maybe see and look into the future is now more a formalized way of ensuring that these types of insight exchanges are happening in the future?
Well, I love to look at history and then look to the future. So I see the history of HIV activism and ACT UP, and I see that reflected today in long COVID,
Mm.
where the playbook from the 1980s and early 90s was picked up by disability activists, was picked up by long COVID activists. I think that playbook is now being used by many patient groups, who are self organizing and contributing to science. And I think that is just going to explode. As we are able to collect our own data, we are going to be able to be doing N of one self experiments, publishing those, sharing those. And it's everyone else's opportunity to learn from the patients and the caregivers and the survivors who are creating these insights and creating this science. Um, and that goes across the board, across every sector of healthcare.
Oh, well, this has been an absolutely amazing discussion. It only scratches the surface of all the amazing examples that you also give in the book. So please pick up a copy. It's so good. I have 2 copies. So go ahead and grab one and you'll learn even more. But thank you, Susannah, so much for sharing your insights here during this virtual event. And for everybody else, please continue to look out for more virtual events in this series, as well as join us at the Rock Health Summit in the fall. Thank you very much. Thanks, Susannah.
Thank you.